Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to our very first session of the conference. My name is Pierce Bateman. I'm a new professor at UAA, and it's my pleasure to get to moderate this wonderful panel. Today, our first session is on historians, interpret Alaskan historians. What a treat. It's kind of the meta-inception of Alaska history. I love it. So today you will hear from three distinguished gentlemen, known to many of us here, and they will regale us with some historians from some of our state's most interesting histories from years gone by. I'll introduce all three of our speakers here, and then I'll be keeping time. So the three distinguished gentlemen, please make sure that you're keeping time, or we'll have to bring out the yoke or the mute function on Zoom, as it were. Our first presenter is Colonel Russ Vanderlust. He serves as commander of the Arctic Aviation Command, 11th Airborne Division, Fort Wainwright. He also holds a PhD in Arctic and Northern Studies, Arctic and Northern History from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he produced a top-notch dissertation titled Among the Dene, Allen's 1885 Trans-Alaska Expedition. Today, however, Colonel Vanderlust will be giving us the third part of a series that he has presented to the Alaska Historical Society these past few conferences. His presentation is entitled The Fall of Ivan Petroff, Part 3, How Alaska's First Historian Perished into Obscurity Following Entanglements in the Bering Sea. Our second presenter this morning is the estimable Dr. Ross Cohen. He's known to many of us as our wonderful editor of Alaska History, the Journal of the Alaska Historical Society. He's the author of several fabulous books, including Fugo, The Curious History of Japan's Balloon Bomb Attacks, and my personal favorite, The Longview, Dispatches on Alaska History. Whenever I struggle with a little bit of writing, I go to Ross for some inspiration. I'll add on a personal note that without Dr. Cohen, my writing would be nothing. I owe him everything, both as a writer and developing as a scholar. So thank you very much, Dr. Cohen. Today, he will be presenting a paper titled Hector Chevigné, One Historian's Journey from Live Radio and Dramas to Scholarly Books. And our final presenter, but certainly not our last or least, is Dr. Stephen Haycox. He is a distinguished professor emeritus of history at the University of Alaska Anchorage. He has taught countless generations of Alaska throughout the duration of his career and introduced many of them to the wonderful field that is Alaska history. His book, Alaska, an American Colony, has been the de facto textbook and introduction for many, many Alaskans on this field. But my favorite book is his Frigid Embrace, Politics, Economics, and Environment in Alaska. Today, he will be telling us about Morgan Sherwood and Alaska history. So without further ado, Russ, take it away.
All right, Pierce, thanks. I've started my timer. All right, let's go. Pictured here is Petroff in a self-portrait while census taking off the island of Nunavik. This sketch accompanied an article in Leslie's Illustrated just 6 months before he was fired by the census director in 1892. Next slide, please. So yes, I'm wrapping up a 3-part series on Ivan Petroff, initiated in 2022 during the conference, and it covers really 3 eras of his career as represented by these 3 photos. And the overarching thesis is that any serious evaluation of Alaska in the late 19th century must come to terms with the sources and enigma of Ivan Petroff, while wrestling with the complex life and bifurcated motivations of Alaska's first American-era historian. Next slide, please. So to review briefly, during the 1880s, the Russian-born Petroff legitimately rose to become the preeminent authority on Alaska. Petroff's role as sole census agent for all of Alaska in 1880, coupled with his role as the primary researcher and author of Bancroft's History of Alaska, published in 1886, led to his ascendancy just prior to his rapid descent into obscurity following his role in the 1890 census and Bering Sea arbitration. Next slide. This brief timeline shows where we'll examine Petroff's later life and his biggest shortcoming, the one that finally caused his downfall, falsifying documents in the Bering Sea arbitration, shown here in red. The 1893 arbitration involved an international tribunal convened in Paris to settle a dispute between the two governments concerning rights and responsibilities in the waters of the Bering Sea. Though Petroff indeed falsified documents by translating early Russian accounts in favor of the U.S. position against Great Britain, he did not act alone. This intriguing story is supported by evidence presented by Alaska's fur seal expert Henry Elliott, demonstrating how Petroff's falsification was discovered, along with the nature of Petroff's confession and potential motivations. So, I apologize for the jets in the background. I'm at Eielson Air Force Base, as you can probably tell. Let's jump into some of the sources and talk about Elliott. Next slide. The first source here is a manuscript written by Elliott and sent to his friend James Wickersham in July 1915 to assist Wickersham in his expansive bibliography. Elliott referenced the second source in his biographical sketch for Wickersham on Petroff, where Elliott cited his own congressional testimony in 1911 during the North Pacific Seal Convention, 15 years after Petroff's death. Elliott's testimony essentially exonerated Petroff as any type of lone perpetrator in the Bering Sea scandal. As seen here, the indomitable Elliott was part naturalist, part lobbyist with the cause, and part lawyer. Elliott claimed he knew Petroff well, having met him in 1876 while working as a translator for Bancroft. Upon the inquiry of John Wesley Powell, Elliott recommended Petroff to Francis Walker, who was the 10th U.S. Census Superintendent, as the right man for collecting Alaska's first official enumeration in 1880. At Walker's request, Elliott also helped Petroff shape up the final manuscript for the census report. And during this collaboration, Elliott was able to size Petroff up. He describes Petroff as tall, spare, with a low voice, very subdued in speaking and action, quiet, and a retiring man of 35 years old when he first met him in 1876. I'd like to show a brief quote by Elliott there. I don't have time to read it, but it's at the bottom, and it really gives Elliott's perception of Petroff and his respect for Petroff's work. Next slide, please. The Bering Sea Arbitration of 1893 arose out of a dispute between Britain, Canada, and the United States over the harvesting of fur seals in the 1880s, and more broadly, the right of exclusive jurisdiction in the waters of the sea. Following the Alaska Purchase, the boundary between Russia and the U.S. split the Bering Sea into two parts. The American portion was the larger and included the Pribilof Islands, the principal breeding grounds of the northern fur seal. The fur seal's habitat ranged throughout the Bering Sea. In the 1880s, the U.S. decided to claim exclusive jurisdiction over the sealing industry in the open ocean of the Bering, including all waters surrounding the Pribilof Islands. A U.S. Revenue cutter's capture of Canadian vessels in 1886 led to international arbitration. Next slide. Further complicating matters, the U.S. had granted exclusive rights for harvesting seals on the Pribilof to the Alaska Commercial Company in 1870 through a 20-year lease. In 1890, amid controversy and intrigue, the U.S. awarded a second exclusive 20-year lease, this time to the Northern Alaska Commercial Company. Both companies maintained strong political ties to Washington. Though the United States asserted that Russia had formally exercised exclusive jurisdiction of the sea, which passed to the U.S. at the time of the purchase, essentially the Bering Sea was a Russian lake conferred to the United States. This position proved unfounded. The outcome eventually favored the British, who represented Canadian affairs, and denied the U.S. exclusive jurisdiction. Census enumerator Petroff's role in the affair involved translating Russian documents in such a way as to verify original and exclusive Russian jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Elliott's role involved protecting the fur seals from overharvest and extinction, regardless of conflicting national interest. Next slide. The Benjamin Harrison administration was already infamous for corruption and multiple scandals, including those of Secretary of State James Blaine. Elliott himself was fired from the Treasury Department in April 1891 after acting as a whistleblower regarding a secret permit issued by the Harrison administration to the North American Commercial Company, the recent successor to the Alaska Commercial Company in the Pribilofs. Elliott's earlier 1890 report on the fur seal issue, which Blaine had rejected and then suppressed, owing to its failure to further the administration's agenda ahead of the arbitration tribunal, suggested that the administration favored economic interests rather than ecological or philanthropic goals of preserving the fur seals. Moreover, Elliott openly questioned Blaine's integrity and accused him and his successor, Secretary of State John Foster, of yielding to the North American Commercial Company and appointing corrupt agents, corrupt commissioners, and counsel throughout the whole affair. In his 1911 testimony to Congress, Elliott further explained how corruption plaguing the Harrison administration impacted the arbitration. He specifically accused Foster of lying about Petroff's role in the scandal regarding fabricated Russian translations. According to Elliott, quote, many of Foster's letters carried a fraudulent interpretation of their text in those translations, purposely to show a false contention on the part of the Russian government, claiming exclusive jurisdiction. Foster denounced Petroff as Foster denounced the Russian government and Petroff as having imposed false translations upon him and claimed he was unaware the true content because the Russian materials had never previously been translated. Elliott testified that the documents had indeed been translated earlier, specifically naming the Russian translators, and that he had personally read them 11 years prior. This is an important part of credibility regarding Elliott and his story, and it's corroborated by Henry Allen, who used the same translators in his 1887 report. Even Census Superintendent Robert Porter stated Petroff had, quote, used some translations that had already been prepared. If competent State Department translators were indeed available and documents were previously translated, is this a smoking gun for the Harrison-Blaine-Foster regime? Next slide. The Harrison administration understood both Petroff's genius and his liabilities. Rather than use their staff translators, the State Department had found their man in Petroff. The implication, Petroff was paid or proffered by the administration to create translations favorable to the U.S. position in the Pribilofs. Elliott concluded his testimony as shown in this quote, and note how he states that the false translations were discovered by the British. We'll come to that in a minute. Moving to the next slide, please. Elliott's testimony was indeed damning. Meanwhile, Henry Allen had served as the first permanent U.S. military attaché in Russia during the Bering Sea arbitration. The State Department consulted Allen, the only diplomatic representative who spoke fluent Russian, and regarding whether Russia ever upheld the claim that the Bering was a closed sea. Allen was in St. Petersburg at the time of the inquiry and assisted by looking over the Russian records. He learned that Russia's claim, if such existed, was indeed contested by both Britain and the United States, which, in effect, rendered the latter's claim for exclusive jurisdiction in the Bering Sea hollow. So, Allen's research corroborated Elliott's claim that the State Department was indeed informed that the Russian documents clearly did not support the U.S. case in the Bering Sea, and that the documents in question were also consulted and translated prior to Petroff's fabrication. Next slide. What was Foster's position in the matter? At first, he carefully used passive voice to avoid calling attention to the scandal, avoiding mentioning Petroff by name in an article in the North American Review published just prior to Petroff's death. Foster then provided further explanation when writing his memoirs 15 years later, straying even further from the truth and effectively placing all the blame on Petroff, as can be seen by the highlighted portions in this quote. So, two final points remain to untangle the truth. Determining how Petroff's falsification was discovered and understanding the nature of the confession. First, Foster's story regarding the falsification's discovery directly conflicts with Elliott's claim. Elliott claimed the fraud was discovered by a British agent, not Mr. Mayo, as Foster stated, as can be seen in this quote. In addition, Foster's story that Mr. Mayo's investigation of Petroff's translations was motivated by the need for a, quote, mere pastime also seems unlikely. Richard Pierce seemed to agree that Foster and Mayo's actions could indeed be no accident. How probable is it that a State Department clerk seeking to, quote, practice his Russian happened to check some of Petroff's translations against the original? Instead, Mr. Mayo likely decided to check Petroff's translations because he was told to do so. Without Mayo's direct testimony on the matter, the truth behind exactly how Petroff's fabrications were discovered may be lost to history, especially if Blaine knew that the translations were false all along, and, as Elliott claims, purposefully directed by the administration. Moreover, contrary to Foster's memoirs, William Williams, Foster's counsel, wrote in his memoir in 1943 that he personally discovered the fraud. How Williams made that discovery while admittedly knowing, quote, nothing of the Russian language remains questionable. Next slide. Second, beside the mire of arbitration, Petroff was plainly guilty of fabricating state documents. Petroff confessed, but was his confession authentic or influenced? According to Foster's memoirs transcribed, upon discovery, Foster at once brought Petroff into his office along with other witnesses and accused him of fraud. Petroff then confessed in the presence of witnesses, but did not consent to give any explanation or excuse for his conduct. Foster's story provided earlier to the British differs on this very significant point. Next slide. Here's the confession. So, would Petroff risk his career and certain jail time to promote the value of Russian documents in the state archives in hopes of securing a future job? Despite Foster's explanation of Petroff's motive to the British, Petroff himself provided no such motive. The carefully crafted words here on the quote speak for themselves, both in what is written and what remains unwritten. It's a sad statement. Notably, Petroff signed the statement of confession shown here in the moment rather than deliberately penning a personal letter in his own words. These circumstances suggest the statement was written for him by Foster's lawyers within the State Department. When called into Foster's office, Petroff found himself under a certain degree of duress. Was he coerced or bribed? Presented with no alternatives and under pressure from those in the room, Petroff signed the confession. Next slide. Petroff's confession distressed the director of the 11th Census, Robert Porter. He bemoaned having to fire Petroff and searched for a reason to justify Petroff's error in judgment, even going so far as to consider insanity on Petroff's part. Porter defended the two-time special agent and leader of his 1890 census in the newspapers, or at least tried to let him down easy. Porter said, quote, I have known him for 13 years. His work has never been questioned. He risked his life on 5 or 6 occasions to obtain information from the Bureau. In the census of 1880, he made such remarkable clear enumeration that I appointed him to take the Alaska returns for the census of 1890. He was acquainted with the field as no other man was. He went on to say, I cannot believe that Petroff did this falsification intentionally. If he is not mentally unbalanced, the only explanation I can give is that he used some translations already prepared. He might have done this to save himself the trouble of translating original documents and verifying the information, for he was getting no pay from the State Department for the extra work. End quote. If Porter had read the proceedings of the arbitration trial, however, it seems certain that the translations were indeed intentional. Sir Charles Russell, shown on the right, deemed Petroff a, quote, astute but unscrupulous artist, an ingenious gentleman whose work exhibited complete mastery of both the Russian language and the fundamentals essential to the United States in the Bering Sea case. He said, every word is a forgery and an interpolation, and Mr. Ivan Petroff understood very well what he was about for the purpose of building the United States case. He understood the contention perfectly, and he realized it completely, end quote. Petroff received no such accolades from the American delegation. Even if his genius was fully understood, perhaps Petroff's health was failing, but arguably no one in poor mental health could author such masterful facility and manipulate the argument as Petroff had. His fabrication included the addition of specific Russian claims, so the excuse of Petroff saving himself work or laziness falls flat. Next slide. What if Petroff had been brought to trial and testified under oath? Some scholars espouse the very reason Petroff was not brought to trial was due to lacking evidence, pointing to the weak grounds on which to prosecute. In so doing, however, they ignore Foster's role in the scandal. A trial would have cast the Harrison administration in a negative light, and revealed Petroff as a convenient scapegoat. Instead, these same scholars castigate Elliott for weaponizing a silent Petroff to tarnish the retired secretary's reputation. Though the newspapers announce all officials thus far interviewed assert that Petroff's offense is not punishable by any statute. Williams had written to Foster that Petroff's acts amounted to treachery against the United States. Amazingly, this so-called treachery did not violate any statute according to the U.S. Attorney General. Elliott, however, rightly pointed out that bringing Petroff to trial for his misdeeds would have exposed the ring of corruption within the Harrison administration and its links to the North American commercial company. Secretary Blaine maintained close business associations with many who had ties to the company and to Washington. The administration's close association with members of the commercial company and the clandestine nature of the land killing permit, the awkwardly contrived defense after the permit was revealed, all bear witness to something more than innocent bungling. Petroff, for all his flaws, got caught in the middle. Petroff, seemingly guilty of a crime, was permitted to slip quietly away from Washington and fade into oblivion without being punished as the crime deserved and the law directed. The press and the American people wondered why, as shown by this newspaper clause from 1892. Perhaps protection from a trial was offered to Petroff in exchange for his signed confession. Elliott surmised Petroff may have even received hush money as he left town. Regardless of the cause of Petroff's hiatus from the National Capital Region, it's doubtful he was a rogue falsifier in the scandal. When the opportunity arose, Petroff sought what he longed for throughout his life: financial security, prestige of a stable government position. Petroff's decision followed a predictable pattern in his previous actions. Always on the financial edge, Petroff picked up his pen and provided his employer or his readers exactly what they desired. But Petroff failed to consider the consequences, which eventually led to his undoing of his health and of his employment with the U.S. government. Last slide. In conclusion, the stress of losing his job and the lingering threat of prosecution hastened Petroff's death. Adding to his distress was the news that his former boss felt compelled to expunge his name from his masterpiece, the 1890 Alaska Census Report, which was 3 years in the making. The loss of his legacy and the credit for his work in Alaska were equally devastating to Petroff. But Petroff's fingerprints on the 1890 census were not completely erased. On the front piece of the report is a picture of Alaska census taking in action. The individuals and the location are unnamed, but the scene is unquestionably coastal Alaska. On the right, a tall, spare man stands with clipboard in hand, focused on his work and seemingly unaware of the historic moment. An indigenous family gathers in front of their abode, patiently waiting for the enumerator to record the household so that they can resume their subsistence activities. The location of this 1890 photograph is likely Kodiak Island, overlooking the near island channel to the west by the Alaska Native village on St. Paul Harbor. For Robert Porter, census superintendent, the photo's inclusion was no accident. Porter could publicly say that he had indeed expunged Petroff's name, thus appeasing the Harrison administration and shielding the Treasury Department from the scandal, while still tipping his hat to Petroff. For Petroff, and perhaps everyone who understood the magnitude of his work, the photo would remain in its proper place, front and center in the 1890 Alaska Census. For historians today and in the future who doubt Petroff's work, this image is a reminder to look closely for what is valuable in Petroff and his work, and to be open to the evidence showing Petroff on site, in action, quietly and professionally in the field, doing exactly what he claimed in his writings. Thank you.
Am I on still? Oh, good. Thanks very much, Russ. All right, next up is Ross Cohen. Ross, take it away, sir.
All right. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Jeff, are we on the screen?
Not quite yet. Give me.
Okay.
Oh, no.
Well, while you're loading, let me just tell. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes?
You sound good, Ross. Keep it up.
Okay, thank you, Pierce. Well, I don't know if I sound good. Let's not get carried away. Jeff, while you're loading it, I'll just let you know that my computer is telling me that my internet connection is unstable because of course it is. And so if for some reason as I'm talking, if I start dropping in and out or something, let me know. Maybe I can turn off the camera to try to conserve bandwidth. But let me know if I'm not coming through clearly, please.
Go on ahead,
All
Ross.
set? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be with you virtually, at least. One of the most prominent and influential 20th century historians of Russian America did not, in fact, consider himself a historian at all. Hector Chevigny wrote three major works on Russian America, and he influenced, and one could even say mentored, a number of historians who came after him, including Richard Pierce and Morgan Sherwood. Now, the so-called great man of history school to which Chevigny belonged has long fallen out of favor, but he still leaves a lasting imprint on the field. And scholars of Russian America continue to grapple with and cite Chevigny's works. And yet, Hector Chevigny had no formal training as a historian, something he openly acknowledged. As a young man in the 1930s, just beginning to write scholarly works, he eagerly consulted credentialed historians to make certain his work was on firm ground. And then by the 1960s, when Chevigny himself is something of an elder statesman to whom younger academics like Pierce and Sherwood went for advice, he gave generously of his time, but always cautioned that he did not consider himself an expert. Now, the theme of this conference is rights and responsibilities. And so in this presentation, I will argue that Hector Chevigny took seriously the obligations of historical scholarship. And it is precisely because he lacked formal training or advanced degrees that he worked so diligently, so meticulously to make sure that his work was intellectually robust. Next slide, please. Hector Louis Chevigny de la Chevrotière was born in Montana in 1904 to French-Canadian parents. In his family, for 7 generations, they worked in the fur trade for the Hudson's Bay Company. Chevigny graduated from Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington in 1927, whereupon he enrolled in graduate school at the University of Washington, intending to pursue a career either in medicine or as a teacher of foreign languages. He was, in addition to English, he was fluent in French, Spanish, and German. Chevigny's writing career began in 1929. One of the tenants at the boarding school where he roomed became ill. This woman worked as a scriptwriter for a local radio station, and Chevigny, without telling her employer, covered her assignments for a week. He found that he had a knack for writing and editing radio copy, and it seemed a good way to make a little extra money besides. He later admitted, quote, "I went to a rival station, presented myself as an experienced scriptwriter from San Francisco, and got a job," close quote. When the Great Depression hit a few months later, he decided to weather things out at KOMO, one of the first radio stations in Seattle. But he had such a knack for writing and editing radio copy that he quickly rose to be the head continuity writer at the station. Now, at the time, in the early 1930s, live radio programs were mostly produced in New York and Chicago, and they were generally limited to variety shows featuring a mix of music, vaudeville, and poetry. KOMO, however, by the 1930s, had on its staff announcers, actors, singers, and musicians, and Chevigny recognized that live radio programs could be produced locally. Next slide, please. In 1932, he launched a live radio drama called Pioneers, one of the first locally produced radio programs in Seattle radio history. Now, each episode, dramatized an event in Pacific Northwest history. Early episodes told the stories of British captains James Cook and George Vancouver, also American Robert Gray, who discovered the Columbia River in 1792, John Jacob Astor and the founding of Fort Astoria, the Whitman Massacre, in which missionaries were killed by the Cayuse and Walla Walla peoples in 1847, and so on and so on. Many, many, many other historical episodes. While most episodes focused on the hardships, sacrifices, and determination of the early settlers, others featured more whimsy than drama. Some of the early episodes told the story of boat races, also the history of Seattle's first horse-drawn streetcars, Seattle's first newspaper, and so on. Now, as the series went on and grew in popularity, Chevenix's scripts swelled to include numerous speaking parts. Como began recruiting actors from the Seattle Repertory Playhouse and the UW Drama Department. Here you see an image of the cast and crew of pioneers in the studio. Actors with several lines of dialogue were paid $3 per program, while bit players with a single line earned 50 cents. And sound effects technicians used a variety of props to produce all of the auditory hallmarks of live radio, such as creaking doors, breaking glass, horses' hooves clattering down the street, and so on. Next slide, please. Now, most of the episodes of Pioneers focused on Washington Territory, but Chevenix had long harbored an interest in Alaska, especially the period of Russian colonization. He later said that he developed this interest in conversations with Edmund Meany, the UW history professor, with whom Chevenix consulted regarding the historical accuracy of his scripts. He wrote many scripts about Alaska. One of the first was entitled The Romance of Rezanov, about the founder of the Russian-American company, about which Chevenix told a local newspaper, quote, "It may sound like egotism, but I believe that dialers will find it the most dramatic story of the season," close quote. Next slide, please. Another program, it was a two-part episode entitled The Destruction of Sitka, which told the story of the 1802 and 1804 battles between the Russians and the Tlingit. You might notice here on the script that the authorship is attributed to David Halpern, an individual who worked with Chevenix on these scripts. And although Halpern's name appears on the script, Chevenix did the research and much of the writing for these episodes. This image, incidentally, is of an original Pioneers script, which today are housed in the archives of the Washington State Historical Society in Tacoma. Now, two things bear mentioning here. First, these programs were very much products of their times. Chevenix openly engaged in what we might call pioneer worship, and he presented characters like Nikolai Rezanov and Alexander Baranov as heroes who brought civilization to the wilderness. There is no introspection in these scripts regarding the rightness of the pioneers' colonization, the dispossession of native peoples, and so on. Nor should we really inspect any. That was not part of the historical conversation at that time. Second, for a series that glorified the trailblazers who settled the Pacific Northwest, it should not be surprising that the depiction of native peoples regularly fell back on cliches and stereotypes, many of which were dehumanizing. Indians were nearly always presented as savages, and many episodes in the 3-year run of Pioneers focused on conflicts and confrontations, many of them violent, between the white settlers and native peoples. Natives' dialogue, when natives had any lines at all, was mostly limited to war whoops and broken Chinook jargon. Next slide, please. To illustrate both points, here is the narrator's introduction to the destruction of Sitka, that two-part episode I mentioned a moment ago. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but if you just sort of scan through it, you'll see reference to Pioneer's, quote, combating the rigors of a stubborn land and the savage hostility of the natives. Also references to Baranov as a genius who, quote, fought the bloodthirsty natives who resisted and harassed his every move until at last he founded an empire in the wilderness, close quote. This type of hyperbole, of course, common of historical writing of the era, as well as for a live radio drama where dramatic reenactments is entirely the point. Next slide, please. Pioneers ran for 3 years until 1935, when Chevenix left for Hollywood, where he became the script supervisor for CBS Radio, a position in which he oversaw all of the station's West Coast radio programs. Next slide. Chevenix later moved to New York, and he embarked on a freelance writing career where he continued to author radio scripts, also TV and film scripts, magazine features, and all the rest. He became blind by the time he was 40, but his writing career continued unabated. My Eyes Have a Cold Nose, his touching memoir about his service dog Wizard, became a bestseller when it was published in 1946, and it remains his most celebrated work. Next slide. Chevenix achieved such national renown as a writer that he had endorsement deals. Here he is endorsing Scripto pencils. He's pictured here with his secretary, Beatrice Del Negro, and the ad copy says, quote, Miss Del Negro must be ready to write when Mr. Chevenix starts dictating. No time to sharpen a pencil or replace lead. Naturally, she depends on Scripto mechanical pencils. End quote. Next slide. All right. So it's in this period then when Chevenix is transitioning from CBS radio to freelance writer that he begins writing books on Russian America. Lost Empire, his biography of Rezanov, is published in 1937, and then Lord of Alaska, his biography on Baranov, published in 1942. These were not simply padded book-length versions of his radio scripts, however. He did original research, and he wrote what he wanted to be serious scholarly books that were still accessible to general readers. And this brings us to the matter of Chevenix's dedication to historical accuracy. Even in the early 1930s, when he was writing those radio scripts, he took historical accuracy very seriously. This is from a 1932 letter that Chevenix wrote to Edmund Meany. Quote, incidentally, I am delighted that so far I have received no serious criticism on the score of historical accuracy. I am no historian, although I would like to be, but whenever one sets out to popularize history, distortions will creep in no matter how hard one tries to be fair, close quote. In 1938, at the time that Lost Empire was published, Chevenix wrote to Clarence Andrews, another Alaska historian, quote, I am a professional writer interested in the drama of things and their movement. I do not kid myself into believing that I have the equipment to be a good historian. I have too much respect for people like Meany who are historians, close quote. And then in 1939, when he was working on the biography of Baranov, Chevenix mentioned to a colleague the pressure that he was under by his publisher. Quote, Macmillan feels that I should jack up the title and drive a new book under it. Another way of saying the same thing is that they suggest I change the ending, find a new beginning, and drop the middle portion. You get the idea. Trouble is, I tried to write a history and a book people would buy at the same time. Can't be done, apparently, close quote. But in fact, it was done. Both of these books remained in print and went through multiple editions for the next few decades to the end of Chevenix's life. These books established Chevenix as a leading Alaska historian of the time, so much so that by 1943, he was in talks with the territory's Board of Education about authoring an Alaska history textbook, a project that unfortunately never came to fruition. Next slide, please. And this brings us to Cheveny's trips to Alaska. 1959, Anchorage invites Cheveny to visit and give a talk for Alaska Day, October 18th, 1959. You see here an ad from the Anchorage Times. Cheveny's address, What the Russian Occupation of Alaska Means Now. And if you look at the bottom right, you can see there are only 600 reserved seats. I've given a lot of talks in my career. I think I've maxed out at about 27 people. I can't imagine filling a 600 seat arena. Next slide, please. Here is Cheveny arriving in Anchorage, where he was presented a key to the city. In the lower right, there he is giving a talk in Seward. Next slide. And here is his sellout crowd in Anchorage. The following year, 1960, he was invited to Sitka, where he visited and gave a talk. In 1961, he was invited to Kodiak, but he had to decline that invitation for health reasons. Now, the files of Cheveny's papers are filled with letters of thanks from Alaskans. I'm not going to read them all to you, but here's a letter written by Herb Hilscher. Quote, no single event has engendered a public desire to explore the past as your lecture, your presence, your warm personality, and the spectacular manner in which the show was handled. Dozens of residents have asked to join the Cook Inlet Historical Society. The bookstores have had a big increase in out-of-print books, and many people just wanting to talk with someone about it have remarked to me what a big lift they got out of your presentation of the story of Alaska. Close quote. Next slide, please. Now, Cheveny's talk in Anchorage was recorded, and these tapes are part of the Cheveny papers at Gonzaga University in Spokane. I've spoken to the librarian there, and she has indicated she's very interested in having these tapes digitized. She has neither the funding nor the technological capability to do so, however, and she asked me if I could lend any assistance. Now, I would love to work on this. I have more irons in the fire already than I can handle, so this is not a project I can take on. But if anyone has any information or ideas about how we might get these tapes digitized, assuming the quality is enough that we can still do so, I think that would be really a tremendous source. Next slide. Now, when Cheveny finished the first two books, Lost Empire and Lord of Alaska, he intended to leave the field behind. But he later said he just couldn't leave it alone. As he put in a letter, quote, I was too fascinated by the many byways that had been opened. I went on acquainting myself further with the sources, turning up a number of things on the way, close quote. In particular, Cheveny continued corresponding with Alaska historians such as Clarence Andrews, Richard Pierce, Morgan Sherwood, and others, including Helen Shenitz at the State Library, also Robert Arnold, director of the state's Centennial Commission. This ongoing interest and encouragement from his fellow historians led to his last book, Russian America, published just a few months before his death in 1965. Cheveny dedicated this book to Clarence Andrews, and in his many letters, he was effusive in his gratitude to those historians who had helped him. He said that this book took him 30 years to write, and that he could not have done it without the encouragement and the assistance of the Alaska historical community, to which he was so grateful. Next slide. And in that spirit, I would like to extend thanks to a few people who helped me with this research and this presentation. Jeannie Sherwood, who might be the only one of us here who met Hector Cheveny. I'm grateful to Jeannie for sharing her husband's papers, and also for for telling me how to pronounce Chevigny, which I had pronounced incorrectly for years. Also, Steve Haycox and Pierce Bateman, who helped me with research, so I'm very grateful to them. Thank you, everyone, for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Ross, thanks. Right. Next up, Dr. Haycox, come on up.
I'll tell you when I want the first slide, okay?
Oh, see you right there. Really appreciate the light. Can you hear me okay? Good. Just a thorough delight to be here.
What was it?
Okay.
Give me one sec, please. Where is?
Oh,
Hold on, Kayla. What did I? There it is. And
Jeff is working on this.
excuse me, sorry.
It's a delight to be here. I don't know how many Alaska historical meetings I have.
Close up your mouth.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Thank you. So, delight to be here. I don't know how many Alaska historical meetings I've been to. I think the first one was 1971. A while back. So I sort of consider myself to be the senior participating fossil. Happy to be here. So this paper is not a full biography of Morgan Sherwood. That awaits a different scholar at a different time. Thanks to the trust and generosity of his wife, Jeannie Woods Sherwood, Morgan's papers, beautifully preserved and perfectly organized, presently reside in my study in Anchorage until the UAA archive can receive them. They're having new shelving built. It's supposed to take a couple of months. I think it's been at least 6 or 7. So those papers will go there when they can, with my blessing and encouragement to anyone who might want to take them up. In this paper, I want to demonstrate Morgan Sherwood's significance to Alaska history and show his character as an historian. His commitment to the highest standards of historical research and writing, and his generous counsel, critique, and encouragement to friends and fellow historians and other scholars is plainly evident in his collected correspondence. Many of you likely read one or both of his 2 major books, Exploration of Alaska, 1865-1900, and Big Game in Alaska, A History of Wildlife and People. And it's these that I want to focus on in this paper. If you haven't read his books, I hope that this presentation will suggest to you that you ought to give them a look. You may not know that he also assembled 2 delightful anthologies, Alaska and Its History, and Cook Inlet Collection, both of which explore important and entertaining but little known aspects of Alaska history. First slide, please. So the biographical note. Morgan Bronson Sherwood was born in Anchorage in 1929. He graduated from Anchorage High School in 1947. Soon after, he moved with his family to Southern California, but claimed when interviewed just a year before his death, I never left home. During the summer and fall of 1949 and 1950, to earn money for college, he worked in the bush with an Alaska Railroad field crew, surveying all the property and facilities owned by the railroad from Seward to Fairbanks. In 1949, he began undergraduate studies at San Diego State College, completing his bachelor's degree in 1953. After college, he served in the U.S. Army in Korea, then in Hamburg, West Germany. He began graduate studies after his Army tour at the University of California, Berkeley, where he earned a master's degree in 1958 and a doctorate in 1962. Afterward, he went to Washington, D.C. to work for 2 years with a research team exploring and investigating the history of science in the US. This was headed by his Berkeley mentor, Professor Hunter Dupree, the student of Arthur Schlesinger Sr. One result was a co-authored book on the politics of science in America. By far, a more fundamental result was that while in Washington, he met and married Jeannie. In 1964, he took a full-time position at the University of Cincinnati, but the next year, he was lured back west to accept an appointment to the faculty of the University of California, Davis, where he taught US history and helped edit the journal Agricultural History. His gift as a writer was already on display. Morgan taught and edited and wrote at Davis until 1991, when he retired. He continued to live in Davis and summers at property he and Jeannie bought in Halibut Cove until his death in 2000. When Morgan published his first book on Alaska history, a full monograph, the limited collection of studies of Alaska history included Bancroft, 1886, John Underwood's Alaska, an Empire in the Making, 1915, Jeanette Paddock Nichols' Alaska, a history of its administration, exploitation, and industrial development during the first half century under the rule of the United States, 1924, Clarence Andrews' Story of Alaska, 1940, Stuart Tompkins' Promischleniki and Sourdough, 1945, the recently published Hector Chevigny's Great Alaska Venture, 1965, and not much else. Two overarching themes emerged from most of this collection: Seward's Folly, or the Alaska Icebox, and federal government neglect and abuse of Alaska. There were others, but those were the ones that dominated. Next slide, please. Thank you. In Exploration of Alaska, 1865-1900, published by Yale University Press, Morgan took on both of these and showed them to be myths. Sherwood was an historian of science, and the book, drawn nearly exclusively from primary documents, was an investigation of the use of science in developing an understanding of Alaska. First, he examined the icebox myth, showing that far from the purchase of Alaska being unpopular, the US Senate readily approved the purchase treaty. That was by a vote of 37-2. And editorial opinion favored the acquisition for economic as well as political reasons. This was before Richard Welch published his research documenting that 44 of the 48 major urban newspapers in the US in 1867 editorially either approved the purchase or were silent on it. But the primary theme of the book is that the federal government did not neglect Alaska, far from it. Quoting an 1892 article from the North American Review, Sherwood argued that more was learned of Alaska's geography and topography, its people and its resources in 25 years than the Russians learned in 126 years of possession. That knowledge came from funding from the federal government of Robert Kennicott and William Healy Dahl and the Western Union Expedition, of Henry Allen's exploration of the Copper, Koyukuk, and Yukon River systems, of Alfred Brooks' work for the Geological Survey, and funding of a host of others, funding coming also from the Smithsonian Institution and the US Revenue Marine. Given the tiny population, he wrote, the remoteness of Alaska, the limited economic inducement to development, and the national political, intellectual, and economic atmosphere, he wrote, federal exploration of the far Northwest was relatively fast, extensive, and progressive. In an era devoted to laissez-faire, he wrote, it's a wonder that the government promoted any exploration of unoccupied Alaska at all. The neglect thesis, Sherwood wrote, ignores American social and economic realities and the time extent and the true extent of federal activity in Alaska. The thesis reached paranoid dimensions in 20th century literature, he thought. He attributed this, the arguments of neglect and abuse, to an overemphasis on the political aspects of Alaska history, which he felt misled students by obscuring the significance of other aspects of Alaska history, social, and also science. Sherwood treated several other distortions of Alaska in that book. He did not join the chorus of critics who victimized and villainized the Alaska Commercial Company. He noted that the company treated the native community on the Pribilof Islands with care and respect, that they implemented conservation measures to ensure the health and perpetuation of the seal population. They also explored the myth of the abduction and murder of the Russian Orthodox priest Father Juvenali, showing that the story was a forgery by Bancroft's collaborator, Ivan Petroff. But again, the primary thrust of that remarkable book was Sherwood's demonstration that Alaska historians had distorted Alaska history with the politically oriented neglect thesis. Quite contrary to that notion, the federal government invested funding and resources to Alaska from even before the purchase and acquitted itself responsibly and consistently of what he considered its obligation toward the new territory. One reviewer wrote that with the book, Sherwood was intending to shock, seeking to make certain that the poor cousin representation of Alaska history could no longer go unquestioned. It was the first to fully document the government attention to Alaska, and it is this, I contend, that makes the book significant for Alaska historians and for the Alaska story. Next slide, please. Soon after the publication of Exploration of Alaska in 1965, Morgan published an anthology which has been sorely neglected and is barely known today, Alaska and Its History, University of Washington Press, 1967. The 25 essays selected from 11 journals and 3 books explored salient aspects of the Russian experience, the transition, the American period. He included Richard Welch's article on editorial newspaper support of the purchase, also an exploration of the Bering Sea seal crisis, and 2 on the Alaska boundary crisis, among others. Emphasizing some of the topics from Exploration of Alaska, he included articles on Sheldon Jackson, Harry Collins, George Davidson, Robert Campbell, and others. He reprinted an article on Ivan Petroff, Bishop, later St. Innocent. Republication of this very useful collection would be a boon to Alaska history students. In 1974, next slide, please. Morgan published a delightful anthology of 33 secondary readings centered on South Central Alaska, many of which historians treat as primary documents, the things that he included, including Cook, Voronov, George Davidson, William Healy Dahl, C.C. Georgeson, and others. Titled Cook Inlet Collection, it shows how informative and delightful a professional, careful collection of relevant readings can be. Because of the nature of the selections, it's as relevant now as it was when it was published, and should get more attention than it does. Sherwood's study of the history of science underscored the historian's commitment to reconstructing the empirical facts of a topic And his exploration of science in Alaska led him to a careful examination of the role of Alaska's natural resources in the territory's evolution. He was especially interested in the impact of the burgeoning conservation movement from the beginning of the 20th century. His inventory of his inventory of Alaska resources led him to a keen interest in the sustainability of those resources. What he found was twofold and not dissimilar from his finding in his previous monograph. First, increased federal presence in Alaska's development. And second, a politicized reaction to that presence, both by residents and some of the historians who addressed it. Somewhat surprisingly, it was not the withdrawal of land in the 2 national forests or restrictions on mineral exploration that seemed to have generated the greatest impact and generated the most political reaction. It was instead federal regulations of hunting. His exploration led Sherwood to his second full monograph. Next slide, please. Big Game in Alaska, History of Wildlife and People, 1981. Again, Yale University Press. A work of broad research and exemplary scholarship, Morgan used a suit by World War II commander of the Alaska Defense Command in 1941, General Simon Bolivar Buckner, who sought to secure resident hunting license for all troops serving in the territory, at that time numbering tens of thousands, to highlight the history of game regulations. For many Alaskans, native and non-native, hunting was essential, providing food for survival and material for clothing and other uses. Game regulation began at the turn of the century, established by the U.S. Biological Survey. Underfunded and understaffed, the survey turned over enforcement to the territorial governors, whose interest in curtailing hunting was, at best, lukewarm. Complaints from residents to Washington, D.C. about any regulatory measures often slowed any pending legislation. Amid considerable confusion, Congress created the Alaska Game Commission in 1925, comprised of 1 resident from each of the 4 judicial districts and 1 member of the U.S. Biological Survey who was resident in Alaska. Their charge was definition and enforcement of hunting regulations. Conservationists wanted the commission to protect various species for preservation, most particularly the brown bear. Many residents, on the other hand, regarded unregulated hunting as their right as intrepid pioneers. They lived with the faulty conviction that Alaska's game resources were inexhaustible and protected by the vast size of the territory. They saw bears, particularly brown bears, as a threat to both humans and livestock. There was a fair amount of livestock, both in the Talanoa Valley and on Kodiak Island, and opposed any such protection. Sherwood quotes Governor Thomas Riggs saying, "The brown bears have no place in the economic development of the territory any more than herds of wild buffalo would have in the wheat fields of Minnesota or the Dakotas." Such sentiment reinforced Sherwood's already strong environmentalist tendencies. Interestingly, though, Sherwood found that a broad consensus emerged during the Depression in Alaska. Residents appreciated the boost to the meager economy represented by sports hunters, whose impact on game population was minimal, but whose expenditures in the territory were not insubstantial. Before World War II, which brought population and an economic transformation to Alaska, pressure on game, Sherwood found, was minimal. But new technologies, accompanied by increased population, greatly increased that pressure. He wrote, "The airplanes, autos, snowmobiles, all-terrain vehicles, two-way radios, and fancy manufactured camping gear made the term roughing it almost obscure. The use of helicopters for hunting demonstrated, he wrote, this man's inability to control the technologies he's capable of creating. The new technologies permanently altered the wildlife-people relationship in Alaska. In exploring that relationship, Sherwood examined the hunting history of Alaska natives. He found that they were effective in articulating their need for protection of game resources and the land they populated, often in league with residents who resisted regulation and not infrequently critical of conservationists who wanted no human impact at all on certain areas of the territory. He also found that there are enough documented wanton abuses of the resources to cast doubt on the notion of indigenes as natural ecologists. He tangled with that proposition in the book he wrote to a correspondence and concluded that whether they were environmentally conscientious or not, after contact, some natives abandoned their eco-righteousness and behaved like the worst of the white despoilers. In the final summary of the book, he wrote, whatever viewpoint prevails, the documentary evidence is overwhelming that Alaska natives at the turn of the century overexploited the game animals on which they depended. They were eagerly joined in that endeavor by white hunters. Perhaps the two races, he wrote, are more alike than some theoretical scholars care to admit. Succumbing to pressure from Alaska political leaders, Congress approved resident hunting licenses for military personnel residing in the territory for a year or more. The subsequent unleashing of bored soldiers on the Alaska environment after the war meant the killing of pretty much any animal that could be shot and much waste. Many animals were killed so far from roads or rails that the meat spoiled before it could be used. It was a dark and grisly time in the history of Alaska, Sherwood wrote. A primary aim in writing the book, Sherwood wrote, was to establish that historians need to pay more attention to Alaska game regulation history if they are to understand the nature of the territory before and after the makeover brought by World War II. The ongoing controversies surrounding the work of the Alaska Game Board since statehood would seem to confirm this. The book is a salient contribution to Alaska studies, which merits more attention than it has done. Review of these books, along with a read-through Sherwood's correspondence, shows clearly his character as an historian. In every case, the research is thorough, dredging primary sources from Fairbanks, Anchorage, and Juneau, Seattle, Chicago, Washington, D.C., wherever there were relevant papers. As it should be, the guiding principle was to go where the evidence took him and to leave no page unviewed, predating Robert Caro's advice recently on his work on LBJ to leave no page unturned. Foremost, the historian cannot omit or shy away from findings and conclusions that may not be popular. The early example is his rebuttal of the neglect and abuse thesis. Later ones included his criticism of the notion of Alaska's resources as inexhaustible and the conviction that Alaska natives were natural ecologists, taking only what they needed and attending to perpetuation of the animals. This finding was mostly ignored by commentators on the second monograph, which he lamented in a letter to a correspondent. Don't leave things unsaid might have been a good motto for him. I remember his review of James Michener's 1988 Alaska, a novel, a large book, you'll remember. At an Alaska Historical Society meeting here in Cordova, Morgan quipped that that book made a better doorstop than a novel. As some of you may know, as an historian, my penchant is for examination of policy and theory. Morgan wrote to me that he usually stayed clear of policy debates, especially in meetings such as this one. He wrote, some of the people up there can get terribly excited over nothing. He did not want to offend in such a setting. In fact, he wrote to me once that he thought I was the only in-resident Alaska historian with whom he did discuss policy. But when it came to publishing his research, he was fearless, as the examples I've discussed, I hope, make plain. I'm not taking time in this paper to discuss two remarkable aspects of Morgan's work. Next slide, please. First, fakery. Throughout his career, he maintained a career-long interest in magic and flim-flam. He liked to emphasize his lateral interest in sham science. He had a built-in detector for quackery. A favorite word that he used was humbug. He thought Americans are now living in a period of exaggerated public gullibility about fake science. As true a statement or more now than it was when he wrote it in 1988. Also, Morgan had a marvelous wit, seldom failing to amuse with a well-placed story, puncture, or entendre. I'll give just one example. I received an email from him in mid-October 2000. He told me he had esophageal cancer and that it had metastasized. He was not bitter, he wrote, just disappointed, as he had projects he still wanted to undertake. Next slide, please. He said he'd already voted by mail in the general election of that year. It delighted him, he wrote, that his vote would be counted whether or not he was still around. He said it made him think of the fellow who wanted to be buried in Mayor Richard J. Daley's Chicago so that he could remain politically active. He died on October 31, 2000. I want to close with a favorite quote of Morgan's, a question he used as an epigram in his Cookendit collection. I think it captures Morgan's sensitivity perfectly. You do not need to scratch Alaska bare to get a living now. The greatest wealth of Alaska is her beauty. How can any of us who love Alaska, who are not just seeking a quick buck, agree indifferently to spoil her fair face? Morgan Sherwood was, in my judgment, a highly important historian of Alaska, exploring in his monographs, collections, articles, and presentations areas of unexpected or neglected significance. He was a model of meticulous research and courageous and principled writing. His work, I believe, will endure and inform future historians and students of Alaska. I think he is richly worthy of your attention, and I commend him to you. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that leaves us with about 15 minutes for some questions. Would anyone like to ask a question of one of our three wonderful presenters? Katie Ringsmith, I'm coming to you. Hot mic is on.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank all of the presenters, Russ and Ross. Very disappointed you did not make the trip to see us today in person. It would have been lovely to see you, but thank you guys very much. Great presentation. But my question is actually for Steve Haycox. So Steve, one of my favorite and probably overused quotes from Sherwood that I've used in my work, I can't quite remember exactly, but the gist of it is that in the replacement of the long rifle for the briefcase. on the Alaska frontier. Could you maybe put that quote into a bit of a context for the audience today?
Great question, thank you for that. I think he was prescient in wanting to see an end to the romanticized pioneer history, which I think now is been fairly put to rest by contemporary historians of Alaska. I think that he understood that distorted the way that we understand Alaska, and that it was a terribly misleading distortion. One of the things he liked to say is that the romanticized celebration of the sourdough miner is not at all representative of the life that has been lived by most of the people who have lived in Alaska. Not representative of native life in Alaska, and not representative of the 80% of the population of Alaska that lives a very comfortable urban lifestyle. So it's a great quote, I think, in capturing exactly that transition that we've made as Alaska history. So, thank you.
I have a quick one. Ron, how did you pronounce Petroff's name? Because I went to UAF and I had Mary Manguso, who my teacher of Alaska history, and she pronounced it Shivani.
Yeah, there was the audio dropped for a minute there, but I think I heard that. How you pronounce Chevigny? I always thought it was Chivigny, like a hard G, Chivigny. That's how I said it. And then and Jeannie and Morgan, they knew the Chevenys. The Chevenys, they lived in New York in Gramercy Park. And Jeannie and Morgan visited them several times in the years before Cheveny's death, and Jeannie corrected me on the pronunciation. I always thought it was Chivigny, but it's Chevigny.
Thanks for correcting that for all of us, Ross. Ross, I've got a question for you. Since I got to look at some of those papers, did you have any what was on the chopping block with your paper with the Clarence Andrew papers? What else can you tell us of Hector and Clarence's relationship, and any other takeaways from that relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. What Pierce is referring to is the Clarence Andrews papers are in Eugene, Oregon, at the University of Oregon, and Pierce helped me with that research. The thing that jumps out at this, and anyone in the room who has done original research and read letters knows, you really get a feel for the friendships, the relationships, even sometimes the rivalries between people. With Cheveny's correspondence, whether it's with Richard Pierce or Morgan or Clarence Andrews or Edmund Meany, is just what a wonderful man he was. There was never a harsh word for anyone. Actually, I take that back. He had a harsh word for Ivan Petroff, of all people. Anyway, but Pierce, to get to your question, it was quite remarkable to me just how much these historians shared their research with one another. Clarence Andrews was actually working on a book about Alexander Baranov at the same time that Chevigny was. But Andrews didn't tell Chevigny that he was already working on this project, and he shared his research with him quite openly. And I'm reading these letters thinking, man, when I'm going to tell my wife that when I'm gone to burn my file cabinet, because I don't want any of you people benefiting from my hard work that I did in the research. It's remarkable to me just how collegial these historians were and how much they shared their knowledge. It's really quite remarkable.
Awesome, thanks, Ross. Anybody? Oh, want to move on?
This question is for Ross. Is there somewhere to listen to Hector's live radio dramas?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so. I have not been able to find any evidence that those radio programs were recorded and preserved. You can't prove a negative, so I cannot definitively say that there are no recordings. I have looked everywhere I can think of, and I haven't found any, even to the point of contacting Como Radio and TV, which is still a going media company here in Seattle. And of course, they're public relations people. They don't know and don't really care. Um, all I can say is that I think it's highly doubtful that any recordings of those programs were made. This is 1932 to 1935. They were live programs. It's difficult for me to imagine that the station first would go to the expense of making recordings for what was meant to be just a one-time only show. But even if recordings were made, the likelihood of them being preserved in an archive for what 90 years seems pretty slim to me. So I haven't found any, and I suspect none were made.
Well, it's a follow-up on that. You said that the scripts exist. Are there a full run of the scripts for all of the shows? I don't know how many years you said that was.
Not a full run. The program aired for 3 years, 91 episodes, if I'm remembering correctly, and there are about 35 scripts that survive. So there are quite a few, but not the entire run.
Fascinating. You first.
I just wonder if Russ would want to say any comments in defense of Ivan Petroff.
Well, Ross, I think Petroff has a right to face his accused. So what did Chevany say? What was so disparaging? And then the second question is, I really appreciated Dr. Haycox's presentation on Morgan Sherwood, touching and hugely influential to me personally. He wrote a chapter on Petroff, the enigmatic Ivan Petroff, and, really a pioneer of research, because before that, as you stated, there was no point of departure really. And interesting little anecdote, he wrote a chapter on Henry Allen as well. And when I was doing my primary research in the Library of Congress, I actually came across Sherwood's notes, which he accidentally left in the Henry Allen papers on Allen. So I kind of feel like I've followed in some of his footsteps and really regret never getting to meet Morgan.
Yeah, Russ, I'll see if I can track down the citation and send it to you. But Chevany, it was something along the lines of he had read Petroff's work and took it seriously and was prepared to cite it and base his work on it. And then he learned, whether rightly or wrongly, that it was fabricated. And I think he was just disappointed that he had invested time into papers that were not reliable. I'll find the citation and send it to you.
Thank you. One more back here.
I was listening for Ross. I was wondering, I haven't read a whole lot of news. You often change ourselves now. Because Lord of Alaska reads like a Hollywood Western. I mean, it's so vivid scenes. It's like, where do you draw the line between, maybe the dates and the location and the personnel is correct? Like, it's like, it really reads more like fiction. And so, like where do you see that line between, I guess history as we expect to be practiced today, and something where you're making your studies?
Was that?
Did you get that?
No, actually, I didn't get a word of it. I'm sorry, I have to ask you to repeat, but I didn't hear any of that.
All right, I think to summarize Rebecca's question here, she's asked, she says that Lord of Alaska reads like a Hollywood Western. And what was the second part of that? I know that I'm on the spot, I've forgotten about that. Where do you draw the line of that kind of fact or fiction in there? What is your assessment of that work? What you've investigated, and with what Clarence Andrews perhaps fact checked you didn't?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can speak to the fact checking of the book itself. I'm not actually a historian of Russian America, so I don't think in a position to go through any of these books and account for their veracity. What I will say is that going through Cheveny's correspondence, it's clear that he did take historical accuracy seriously. But he also wanted to write a readable book. He was in many ways a script writer throughout his career, and he wanted a story that was dramatic and engaging and that would draw readers in. And so he was constantly feeling that tension. I do know, though, there are in his first book, the one on Rezanov, there are a couple of errors in the book that he only discovered were errors after the fact. And in his letters, he is deeply regretful that errors made their way into print. Look, as someone who, in my own work, I've made a couple of boo-boos and only discovered it later, I know that feeling. It's an itch that you'll never be able to scratch. And I think that speaks to his his integrity and how he attempted to always be accurate in everything that he wrote.
One last question. All right, Shauna, it's you. Closing question, no pressure. Get it good and close there so they can hear you online.
What do I push? Can anybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, this actually is not a question. This is something that I thought that Steve and some of the other people in the audience might be interested to know. So Morgan Sherwood was the keynote speaker at a local history conference in Kenai in 1974. And 7 years ago, while working on the Centennial project, we found the lost video tapes. And those were digitized and rescued out of the Juneau Air Library. And I have copies of that material and have tried to distribute some of it. So if anybody wants to get digitized videotapes of Morgan Sherwood in 1974, see me after class.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I brought my.
So, ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for our presenters. And thank you very much. These games really long. Where do you go? Go get out some things.